Hi, I'm Jay Blevins, a licensed marriage and family therapist at I1 Therapy in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Jasmine St. John at JSJ Therapy, and I'm a licensed systems therapist also in Madison, Wisconsin.
And thank you for tuning in to our first video response to the advice column at MadisonKink.com. And this week we got an email from Kat in Madison who was asking us to discuss the connection between abuse and trauma and kink and BDSM. And so we're just going to chat amongst ourselves a little bit about that. And, that's a really big topic. It can mean a lot of different things. And I know one of the first things that jumps out to me is people always ask about, aren't people into this because they have a history of abuse?
Right. They're totally afraid that if they're getting into this, that it's because they had some sort of traumatic experience or abuse that they experienced.
Exactly. And actually, the interesting part is research says that's just not true, that there is not a higher incidence of trauma and abuse in the kink community than there is amongst the vanilla population. And so having a desire for kink and BDSM activities does not mean that you came from a place of trauma and abuse. And likewise, if you have experienced that, it doesn't mean you're destined to end up in the BDSM and kink community.
Right. And if you're also interested in being a dominant or a sadist, it also doesn't mean that you came from abuse or that your interest in that is because you were abused.
Right, and it also doesn't mean you're taking advantage of someone if you are a sadist or a dom, that you're not necessarily picking on abused people and creating that. So that's kind of the history part. What about people? How do you deal with it in the midst of kink and BDSM activities?
Right. So basically, it would behoove anybody that has had traumatic or abuse experiences to be cognizant of the fact that these things might be triggering. It is possible within a scene to be triggered with words or different behaviors, or even the sort of scene energy can be something that's triggering. And it's unfortunate, but many people are either shy or feel shame about what they've experienced, and so they won't share it with their partners, and that's a really big deal. And part of the reason why is so that you can have safeguards against this.
Well, and what's interesting is people often do that to protect themselves, but they also need to protect their partners, because if you were someone who had a play partner who had a history of trauma and abuse and you didn't know that and you triggered them in a scene, that could really make you feel terrible about yourself and feel a lot of guilt and shame about what you're doing, when in fact it's not really related to that. If there's good communication and people know, hey, this might happen, can you avoid these things? If something does happen that we didn't expect or accidentally do something, this is how we want to respond to it.
Exactly. And so you basically, once you talk with someone, you can set in these parameters of either things that you won't do so that you won't be triggered, or that the person can know just in case you are triggered. And then if you experience a trigger within a scene that nobody expects, one of the things that we most directly recommend is something that we call coming back to your five senses, which is just becoming present. And what you do is you ask yourself, what is it that I see, smell, hear, taste, and touch? And when you do that, you come back to center into the present moment, as opposed to reflecting back into the triggering moment.
That's great. And this is really a big topic. We could talk about this for hours, but why don't you tell them about the podcast we recently did?
Oh, right. So we recently did a podcast with Dan and Dawn at Erotic Awakening, and we talked with them about their personal experiences dealing with trauma and abuse, and how the longevity of their relationship has really come into its own based on being able to talk about these things. And if you're interested in more information on that, we'll provide the link below.
So there is a really quick answer to the question for Kat, and I appreciate her writing in. If you have questions for us that you'd like us to discuss, you are welcome to email us at advice@madisonkink.com, or go to madisonkink.com, and there is a link to submit questions there. So either way, we hope to see you back here in a couple weeks when we'll have our next response.
Bye!
Bye!